Hello, cats and kitties. It's Terry Lee here, and welcome to another true crime video. We're not in black and white today just because I felt like being in color. So today's episode is going to be about a guy named Daniel McNaughton. And McNaughton is how his name is spelled for the most part. It's M'Naghten, but sometimes you see McNaughton, McNaghten. So I'm going to try to remember McNaughton because that is the way that his birth name was spelled. It doesn't start being spelled McNaughton until about the time he goes to trial. So I guess you can tell by now that Daniel is going to be the one committing the crime here. So let me get my glasses on. Bam. And we will get started. Okay, Daniel McNaughton was born in 1813 in Scotland, probably in Glasgow, but we're not 100% sure about that. He was the illegitimate son of a wood turner. Now, a wood turner was a tradesman that would take pieces of wood and they would connect one side to a part that would spin and the other side would hold the wood in place. And they would use carving tools and they would carve the wood as it would spin around. Now, if you want to, you can actually go and look this up on YouTube, and there are some really cool videos of wood turning. They make everything from ornaments to bowls to, it's just amazing. I'm shocked at what they can make. But anyway, he was the illegitimate son of a wood turner. After the death of his mother, when he was young, he went to go live with his father's family, and he became an apprentice in his father's wood turning shop. However, Daniel's father, when he got older, did not make him a partner in the wood turning business, which is kind of odd, and I didn't see anything in my sources as to why that was. So he wound up leaving the wood turning business, and he became an actor for a few years. Now, again, my sources, I could not find where he acted, whether he acted in Glasgow or whether he went, somewhere else, but he was an actor for a few years. And then later, he would set up his own wood turning shop in Glasgow. So he went back to the wood turning thing. Now, Daniel was somewhat of an academic. He was an avid reader. He taught himself French, and he joined a debating society. His political views were progressive for the time, and in his shop he employed a chairist. Now, a chairist was a political movement that basically was a workers' reform movement, looking for better conditions for workers, better pay for workers, and as you might imagine, it was not smiled upon by the government. The government was not a fan of the chairist movement. So the conservative government at the time. In December of 1840, Daniel sold his wood turning business, and he divided his time between London and Glasgow. He attended anatomy lectures while in Glasgow, and in 1841, he began to start experiencing some delusions. He began to think that the Tories, the conservative government that was in power at the time, they were persecuting him. They were following him, and they were getting spies to go after him, and they were just really messing with him. And he told some people that. He told his father, he told the police commissioner, and he told a member of parliament. He told all these people that the Tories were out to get him. Now, nobody really took him very seriously because they thought that he was experiencing delusions, which he was, and they never thought that he would do anything about it, but they were wrong. On January the 20th, 1843, Daniel McNaughton shot Prime Minister Robert Peel's private secretary, Edmund Drummond, as he was walking toward Downing Street in London. He shot Drummond in the back, and he was immediately restrained by a police constable before he could fire another pistol that he had with him. So he would have shot twice, but he didn't get a chance to. Now, Daniel McNaughton was under the impression that he had shot the Prime Minister. It was a case of mistaken identity. He did not realize that he had shot the wrong man. So the interesting thing about this is that at first, Drummond's injuries were not that bad. He actually walked away from the shooting, and people thought that he was going to be okay. But complications began to set in, and possibly they were because the surgeon who took the bullet out of Drummond's back also was into bleeding and leeching. Now, when I read this, I was astounded because I thought that bleeding and leeching went out with like the 15th century, 16th century. I was not aware it was still being used that late. But anyway, possibly because of the surgeon's use of this, complications set in, and Drummond actually died 5 days after the shooting. So now Daniel McNaughton is guilty of murder. The next morning after the shooting, McNaughton appeared in front of the magistrate's court and made a statement about how the Tories had driven him to attempt the assassination. And he said, and I quote, "The Tories in my native city have compelled me to do this. They follow me wherever I go and have entirely destroyed my peace of mind. It can be proved by the evidence. That is all I have to say." And that really was pretty much all he had to say, except for pleading later on. He did not say anything more about the incident. Left it to his lawyer. After McNaughton was arrested, his father convinced the jury to adjourn and give him some time to help get his son a defense and to evaluate his state of mind. And the court set a trial date for March the 3rd, 1843. When asked how he pleaded, McNaughton said, "I was driven to desperation by persecution. I am guilty of firing." Now, this was taken as a not guilty plea because basically it was believed that he did this under delusion or duress. So they just went ahead and recorded it as not guilty. So even though he said he was guilty of firing, they said, we're going to call that not guilty. All right, both the defense and the prosecution brought up the issue of legal insanity. Both agreed that McNaughton was experiencing paranoid delusions at the time of the shooting, but they disagreed on some very key things. The prosecution argued that McNaughton was responsible and knew that he was committing a criminal act. Now, the prosecution called some witnesses to actually verify that fact. One of them was his landlady, was McNaughton's landlady, and those witnesses said that he seemed to act generally sane. So that was their argument, that he knew what he was doing, that his responsibility was intact. The defense said that McNaughton's paranoid delusions had led to an emotional and moral breakdown. And according to their medical experts, it caused him to lose control of his actions, and he just was compelled to do it. The defense called witnesses from Glasgow to testify that McNaughton had acted oddly and had talked about these delusions, and that therefore his sanity needed to be questioned. The prosecution provided no medical witnesses at all. The defense did, the prosecution did not. The trial came to an end with prosecutor Sir William Follett saying, "I cannot press for a verdict against the prisoner." So even the prosecution is saying, I can't press for a guilty verdict because there's some stuff going on here. The Chief Justice, Tyndall, told the jury that if they found McNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity, that he would get the proper care that he needed. So subsequently, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity, and they didn't even retire to deliberate. They just came back with that immediately. McNaughton was not set free. He just didn't go and roam the streets. He was transferred to the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum at Bethlehem. Now, I'm not calling anyone a lunatic. That's literally the name of the facility. And he spent the next 21 years at Bethlehem. In 1864, he was moved to the new asylum at Broadmoor, and by that time he had developed heart problems. He was declining in his health. He was not in good health at all, and he died the following year, 1865, at Broadmoor. Now, right after the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity was rendered, there was a public outcry, and there was even some concern by Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria had been the target of an assassination attempt. So you can see how she would think that, if people can say that they're insane and get away with an assassination attempt, this might be a bad thing for the royals, for MPs, for justices, for that type of thing. So she was really concerned about that. Because of this, the House of Lords, which is one of the Houses of Parliament in England, the House of Lords invoked a right to question the judges of the Court of Common Appeals, and that is the court that hears things that don't have to do necessarily with the king, have to do with the things that do with the people. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to ask questions of the Court of Common Appeals about the insanity defense. And the judges' answers to these questions became what we now know as the MacNaughton Rules. And they are rules that decide whether or not a person is sane, legally sane, when they commit a crime. So let me give you the 5 points of the MacNaughton Rules. Number 1 is every man is presumed to be sane and to possess a sufficient degree of reason to be responsible for his crimes. So we start out with every man is sane. We have to prove insanity. We're going to start with sane. Number 2, an insane person is punishable, quote unquote, if he knows at the time of his crime that it was a crime, that it was wrong. Number 3, to establish a defense of insanity, the accused, by defective reason or disease of mind, is not in a position to know the nature and consequences of his actions. The insane person must be considered sane in the same situation. Whoops, I'm reading the next one. I'm sorry. He is not in a position to know the nature and consequences of his actions. In other words, he does not understand that they're wrong. He does not understand the consequences that they would have. Now, the next one. The insane person must be considered in the same situation as if facts with respect to the delusion were real. Now, I read that 4 times when I first read it to try to figure out what it meant. I think what they are saying there is even if the facts of the delusion were real, would the action committed by the defendant be wrong? And would he know that they were wrong? So let's say that Daniel MacNaughton was being persecuted by the Tories. Even if he were being persecuted by the Tories, it would still be wrong to commit murder, and he would still have to not know that it was wrong. So even if the delusions are fact, that still doesn't get you away from did you know it was wrong. And last but not least, it is the jury's role to decide whether or not the defendant is sane. So that's not something that a judge does. It's not something that the prosecution or the defense does. The jury is the one that makes that decision. So the big thing about the MacNaughton Rule is the understandability of right and wrong. I've got that in quotes because that's a quote. And that's the key. The lack of control or compulsion or impulses, that was completely ignored by the MacNaughton Rule. It didn't matter if you felt like you were compelled to do it. What mattered was, did you know it was wrong in the moment? So those 5 points have kind of been summarized into this as the MacNaughton Rule. The MacNaughton Rule is to establish a defense on the ground of insanity. It must be clearly proven that at the time of the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defective reason from disease of mind as to not know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know, that he did not know it was wrong. And the prosecution has to prove sanity. In other words, the burden of proof is on the prosecution to say, yes, no, he's sane. Let me tell you why. So that was the standard forever, and then became the Reform Act of 1984. This said the defense had to prove insanity rather than the prosecution prove sanity. Expert witnesses cannot address the idea of legal sanity. In other words, you couldn't have an expert witness come in and say, he's legally insane. No, they couldn't do that. All they could do was testify to the defendant's mental health and his capacity for understanding. That was it. Remember again, the jury has to make that decision. Okay, some experts believe that the MacNaughton Rule was a problem simply because it didn't take into account impulses, compulsions, that sort of thing. That kind of brings me to the case that we talked about before of Herbert Mullen, who felt compelled to commit sacrifices so that he would stop impending cataclysmic earthquakes. It's not that he didn't know it was wrong. We know that because of the fact that he hid a body. We know after he stabbed the priest, he ran away. If you haven't watched that video of mine, you can go back and watch it and get a more detailed idea of what the case facts were. But the fact was, he did know that it was wrong, and did labor under some indecision about it. But he felt like he had to do it in order to save lives. So maybe not under the McNaughton rule is he insane, but maybe in some other way. And that's where we're getting to now. We're getting to other tests for legal insanity, because some states now 100 plus years later are still using the McNaughton rule, but some aren't. About half the states now use the McNaughton rule, but other states use other tests for legal insanity or sanity, and this is what they are. First of all, there's the irresistible test. Defendant is unable to control their impulse due to a mental disorder, leading to the commission of a criminal act. So they are unable to control impulses, whether they know it's wrong or not. Number 2, the model penal code. Defendant is unable to act within legal constraints or fails to understand the criminality of their actions due to a mental defect. So that's kind of like the McNaughton rule, except for the first part, they're unable to act within legal constraints. So they don't have the capability to do it. So that's a little bit different than the McNaughton rule. And last but not least, there is the Durham rule. Defendant's mental defect led to the commission of a criminal act regardless of the clinical diagnosis. So, in other words, the mental defect that happened, no matter what their clinical diagnosis is, it could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be paranoid schizophrenia, whatever. If their mental defect led to the commission of a crime, then they cannot be held responsible. Now, you're like, mental defect. Okay, mental defect is an interesting legal term because you can actually have somebody found guilty with mental defect. And what that means is they will go to prison, but they will supposedly get treatment while they are there. I don't know how often that truly happens. I hope every time, but hard to say. So Daniel McNaughton's case had far-reaching consequences. Literally over 100 years of legal sanity or insanity was determined by the rules that were set up after his case. So, we think about people who are clearly mentally unwell but were found legally sane. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. He pled not guilty for reason of insanity, and you would think anybody that takes people and dissolves them in vats and tries to make zombies from them and, all of this, clearly they're not well. Clearly they're mentally ill. The question is, did he know what he was doing was wrong? And there's evidence to support that he did. He tried to get rid of the bodies. He tried to keep everything hidden. He even admitted to knowing that he knew that what he was doing was wrong and that he wished he could have talked to somebody about it and he wished he could have stopped. So it's a little bit hard to get a legal insanity defense from that. I actually think Herbert Mullen's defense is probably closer. Even though he took steps to cover his tracks, he firmly felt like he was providing a service that he absolutely had to do to save mankind. So this is my question to you guys. What do you feel about the McNaughton rule? What do you feel about the insanity defense? Do you think simply having a mental defect, as they say, a disease of the mind, a diagnosed mental illness is enough to support an insanity defense? In other words, if someone is paranoid schizophrenic and suffering from delusions and hallucinations, and they commit a crime because of those delusions and hallucinations, even if they cover the crime up, does that mean that they are guilty? Or is that action blamed on their mental diagnosis? It's an interesting thought. Here's an interesting thing to know, though. You know, like with Daniel McNaughton, if you are found guilty, or excuse me, not guilty by reason of insanity, you don't just walk out on the street. You are committed to a high security facility, mental health facility. Let's see, I can try to think of some ones off the top of my head. Andrea Yates is one, a mother who drowned her 5 children, found guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity in her appeal trial, and at this point is still in a mental facility. In fact, every time that it has come up to talk about releasing her from the mental facility, she just waives that right. She knows that she's not well and she just stays there. So that's the idea. Yes, they might eventually be released from the mental facility, but generally it's years and years and years. So that's something to think about when we talk about not guilty by reason of insanity. That doesn't mean they just waltz out into the street. So what do you guys think about that? I kind of really want to know what your thoughts are on it. And I also want to ask you guys if you have requests for the next true crime. I will tell you, I'm not crazy about doing true crime where kids are hurt. I don't know why, that's kind of like a line that I draw. But if you have a true crime story that you would like for me to feature, then I would be happy to do that. And I hope that you guys are well. I know this one was short, but I'm hoping it's going to make you guys want to discuss it and want to give comments and that kind of thing. And I am not a lawyer, so if I presented any of this in a bad way or an incorrect way, I'm very sorry. I tried really hard to get it right, but I was a teacher, not a lawyer. All right, guys, I hope you're well, and I hope that you're safe. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next video.